And now we're into the lab portion of our test. Here, I'm going to take a GH4 with a B4 lens. I'm going to take an LS300 with a B4 lens and the URSA Broadcast with a B4 lens and see how they compare with a little bit of low light, high gain testing. All right, this is the LS300 shooting in 4K at 150 megabits a second. I have set it to the full Super 35 area. We are at f2 on the lens, ISO 1600, 1/60th of a second for shooting 30p, and I have the zebra set to 75 on the yellow tape. There's some black background out of focus out there, and hopefully that will help reveal noise, as we may have some noise in the shot at ISO 1600. I'm not going to do a whole big range. I'm just going to try and get one equivalent across all three cameras and see how they compare. This is the GH4 shooting in 4K P30. I am at 1/30th of a second, f2, ISO 3200 to get the zebra on the yellow tape at 75%. Depth of field is a bit greater than the larger sensor in the G and the LS300. All right, and here we have the Blackmagic Design URSA Broadcast. I have 75% zebra on the yellow tape, and to do this, the lens is opened a little bit wider than the other ones. The camera is set to 12 dB of gain, which is as high as it goes. The shutter is set to 1/30th of a second, which is as slow as it goes. So compared to the other cameras, this is a bit of a struggle to get as much light in. The doubler on the lens is not engaged. I wanted to give you my basic walk around this camera. There's some interesting things that Blackmagic has done here that I guess users of the URSA cameras or the URSA Mini will be familiar with, but coming to this camera from the broadcast arena, which is a big ENG type camera, to this small little compact camera is actually kind of interesting. You've got this viewfinder which attaches with a handle, and then on the bottom of the handle you have to attach a plate, and then you slide the viewfinder into the plate, screw down on the thing, so that this way you can loosen this and then you can adjust fore and aft a little bit. What it does is it adds a lot of metal, and the viewfinder is metal and it's heavy. I've said it before, and lightening this load would be wonderful because all of this doesn't need to be as die cast as it is. I mean, here's the viewfinder, and like I've said before, the viewfinders on ENG cameras with tube displays in them have been plastic for decades, so this is kind of over-engineered. Power switches on top. There's a menu sitting right here, and I haven't read the manual, I'll admit that, but I cannot figure out the menu button and everything. I have gotten the iris to work with this knob here, although you can just switch this in the manual and use your iris just with ease. But you can also do it from here when it's plugged in. It's not plugged in right now. The shutter, gain, and white balance are all right here. I also have a challenge with the white balance in that I've point it to cards and I push the white balance selector in the front and it ignores me. I go up and down and it's in manual white balance. So maybe that is the issue. It's in some sort of manual setting. It's not pushing the button. Haven't, like I said, delved into it. The audio settings are actually fairly easy. It's got 2 built-in mics. It's got 2 XLR jacks, and in the back, in the menu system, I can't flip it around. It's fairly easy to navigate through the menus, and I was able to adjust the zebra to my liking, and there's lots of settings in here. They're very easy to get to. You can actually swipe between them, which is kind of interesting. Unless there is a slider on there, then you don't want to swipe because it'll just adjust the slider. So they've got arrows on either side. You've got basic audio settings out here, and then for manual audio, you've got your settings right here for each channel. You also have the ability to adjust various user programmable buttons here, and the viewfinder also has user programmable buttons as well, although I kind of like the peaking and the zoom that they give you on the viewfinder, so I just left that as it is. The camera is a bit wider than most ENG cameras, and part of that is your media slots are on this side as opposed to like media is usually on the outside for cameras because you're not swapping it a lot. There's a gasket that goes around the media bay here. Let me loosen this up. There's a gasket that goes around the media bay here, and when you close this and it locks into place, there's still a little bit of play. So I don't know really how secure that is, because when I look in these media slots, I mean, I can look around and I can see circuit boards in there. So if you're working in a dusty environment, a lot of sand and everything, I'd be really concerned about that in terms of environment getting in there. And also, of course, the top too. The entire top is open for cooling. So this is not a rugged environmental type camera for outdoors. You really got to like find ways to protect this thing if you're going to be in a dusty, sandy water environment. That was kind of a surprise to me. The plate for the battery comes separate. You attach that, and this one is plastic. Given how much metal there is on this camera, I was really surprised to find a plastic battery mount. If anything, I would have liked to have seen the metal mount directly built onto the camera, and then if you need the opposite, if you want to go from V-Lock to Anton or Anton to V-Lock, you know, pick one and then give us an adapter for the opposite. You know, that's as simple as that is. There's a rosette here, so if you're using this in just a little body mode, which the URSA film camera makes sense because you put a little prime lens on the front of this thing. It's a compact little thing that you can put up on a crane, you can do fancy things with. For this type of environment, it's clear that they're just taking the existing URSA design and putting it into a new thing. Like one of the cases at some point, the connections for the viewfinder are not like under here or tucked out of the way. They're just sticking out here on the side, making the camera another inch wider on this side. And there's no way to, you know, have them in a different place. You know, putting them on the back, putting them on top here would have been made more sense since that's where the viewfinder is going to be. ENG cameras, put them on the front of the body so they literally come right up to the viewfinder, but that's not the case here. There's a lens port, which is where the lens plugs in. This is a 12-pin connector. If you have an older B4 lens with a 6-pin connector, like this Fujinon has a 6-pin connector, it ain't gonna work. And realistically, honestly, I wouldn't even bother looking for an adapter because if you have a 6-pin lens, it is so old, it doesn't have internal focus on it, so you're not gonna be attaching filters or filter boxes to this. And the image quality, while it may be good, is not gonna be as good as lenses that have internal focus, that come 10 years later. And it's not gonna be as good as an HD lens. It's not gonna be good as a, you know, certified 4K lens. So if you've got a B4 lens that has a 6-pin connector, count on buying a new lens, a new used lens. The mount right here, it works just like every other, you know, B4 bayonet mount. Let me spin this around for those who haven't seen it. It says 4K and there's this big gap. Why is this here? Because in an ENG camera, this lens would be coming into the camera and then there's a prism that splits the light to 3 different sensors, red, green, and blue. We're dealing with a single sensor camera here, so that sensor is right there. It's right at the front of the camera. So you've got to push the lens away to make up for the distance. Also, The sensor in this camera is slightly larger than the 2/3 inch sensor that these lenses are made for. So you have to expand the circle of light to cover the larger sensor, which is what the optical adapter does. And in expanding, it also helps to correct for chromatic aberration and possibly some focus issues on the outside. Usually when I take a B4 lens and I put it on a large sensor camera, like my GH4 right there, I have to throw in the doubler. What that does is that expands the circle of light. But these doublers were not meant to be optically perfect all the way to the edges of the glass. They're only meant to cover the center of the circle, which is where the sensor was. Everything else was just going to be off the sensor. It didn't matter. So now, because I'm using the edges, some of these doublers you can see are a little soft on the edges. Maybe it's just because they didn't care. Maybe it's because they weren't ground to the same specification all the way to the edges, because they really didn't have to do that. That was never intended to be used. It works okay. In a lot of cases, you want the center to be more in focus than the edges. You know, people vignette, people blur the edges all the time. Hey, now it's slightly natural. With this camera, you don't have to use the doubler. The doubler, again, is relegated to doubling duties. So you leave it in the normal 1x mode, and then the enlarger in the adapter here expands it a little bit to cover the larger sensor. If you need to get twice as close, you engage the doubler. Now, the bayonet mount has a screw lever here, and you lift it up, and this comes out. There's a pin at the top of the lens. You can see the back of the lens here. The pin at the top of the lens fits in here, and it sinks in all the way. The pin is there so you don't stick it in the wrong way, because there's 3 flanges and it could go in any of those 3 different directions. The pin fits into a hole that's only at the top so that you know you're properly orienting the camera. The lens may not have the lens hood on it, they may not have the power grip on it, so that's why that pin is there. There's also cinema lenses which have none of that and don't have a doubler, so you could in essence end up putting them in where the focus is on the bottom. The pin is there for a reason. Another thing to note is there's a macro on here. These lenses were designed so they could focus really, really close. What you do is you engage the macro and you slide this lever around. In my tests, I found that the B4 lens, the flange distance is slightly different on this camera than it is on my GH4, and I did not readjust it between the two. So you'll see when I zoom all the way out on the GH4 from the brick wall, it gets a little softer. That's the back focus issue. The back focus is a separate knob back here which you can loosen, and you're moving the rear elements of the lens ever so slightly to compensate for the lens. I'll have a separate video talking about back focus, which has been a big issue, and there's lots of different ways to do it, but realistically, there's one good way to do it, and then there's variations on that. And I will have a separate video on that. So the lens jack powers the lens, communicates voltage, because when you adjust, now that the camera is on, and I put this in auto or manual, auto, iris, I can adjust the lens. You probably can't see it, but the lens is there to 16, and it goes down to 1.7. Now, there's not a digital communication going on between these things. It's not the camera telling the lens to go to f2.8. It's merely a voltage range from 5 volts to 12 volts or whatever it is. I've never had to engineer it, so it's not information I need to have in my head. But what it does is you're changing this to 6.2 volts, and that equals a certain f-stop on here. So the camera kind of knows where it is, but when the camera says 5.6, it's kind of around 5.6, but it's not exactly 5.6. So it's kind of close. What I did find was, now maybe if this is an iris and I pointed at something brighter, it would adjust. But when I had this dial set to the monitor, which would mean it would change the volume of the monitor in my ear, I don't have iris control, and when I pointed the camera at something bright, the iris didn't adjust. So I still need to learn how this camera is doing all of the features it thinks it should be doing, and some of the features it's not doing. The shoulder brace under bottom it's kind of rubberish. You can push your finger into it, but the surface of it is very plastically. It's very soft. To compare that to, I know I'm out of camera. To compare that to this brace, this is the Zacuto shoulder brace, because I've been putting B4 lenses from my LS300 on my shoulder. This brace is fabric with a gel in here. So when you put it on your shoulder, it sinks down and it does a pretty good job of grabbing. What I would really like is something that's kind of rubberish, so that, you know, like a shoulder strap for a camera, so that when you put it on your shoulder, it's not sliding off. When you do use an on-shoulder camera on your shoulder, there's a combination of forces that are going on here that you don't get when you use a B4 lens with a handheld camera. The camera, because your shoulder is tilted, the camera's falling away from you. At the same time, your hand out here is pushing the camera this way. So you're in essence balancing both of these torques together. If you don't have your hand in here, then the camera's going to want to fall. If you don't have something on your shoulder, then when you're holding this in your hand, it's always pulling down on your hand. By doing this on your shoulder, they balance each other out, and it just kind of sits there. Now the weight in this one is still kind of a little forward. You know, I have this brace set pretty far forward. It could come a little bit further, but then the camera is going to be even further back. If you have a bigger battery, that helps pull the weight back. You can get to a point where, tilt your head a little bit, you can pull your hand out and the camera is just going to sit there. Not this one. This one is still front heavy because there's a lot of weight here and here. Balancing your camera, especially if it's an ENG broadcast type camera, balancing the camera on your shoulder is going to be key to less fatigue over time. Also, like I said, this is not rigged out for audio yet. So there's usually more accessories if you're going to be using this in a news or electronic field gathering type of production. You're going to have a camera light on here, which may pull into the D-tap. You're going to have a shotgun microphone in here that's going to have to be attached somehow. In this case, probably a magic arm with a holder, because there's XLR jacks here, like if you wanted to add a wireless mic. You got space here to attach one, but you've got this rosette that kind of sticks out and kind of inhibits you from attaching Velcro or some other surface here. It would be nice if this panel on this camera was flat and these were pointed more forward so that this was more compact. Now, admittedly, the lens also does stick out, but you don't need to have all of these protrusions all over the camera. Your wireless mic would go here and plug in. Your shotgun mic would go here and plug in. And then, of course, there's also two microphones built into the camera that you can choose in lieu of using a shotgun microphone. There's rails on the front of this thing, and honestly, I don't think this plate is really designed for a broadcast camera. This is more designed for a filmic cinematic camera where you're going to need a matte box or something else in front of it. I mean, for instance, this lens hood can come off, and I have a lens hood for my camera that literally fits on the front, locks into place, and then I've got my brow on top here. Tighten it down, and now I can flag it off, and it looks a little bit cooler, right? But I don't need the rails. I mean, that's how the broadcast system has been made, in that this mount and this whole ecosystem is very robust. It doesn't require the support of rails for follow focus, because you're going to do this manually. Your hand's going to be here because you're operating the camera. The lenses are even designed so that you can attach a focus block directly to it. You don't need rails to attach a focus to it. So if you're doing this in a studio configuration, that cable is going to come up and attach right to the lens itself without the need for rails. Iris is controlled by the camera, and zoom, there's a connection underneath the lens that will come out to a handle controller. So you're operating from back here with no need for rails in front. So overall, it's clear that the URSA lineage is just being carried over into this broadcast camera, which is the first that I'm aware of that allows you to effortlessly put on a B4 lens onto the mount and go shoot. You don't have to have the shoulder mount. You don't have to have the handle. You could use this on a crane or some other stabilizer and just go. But if you like to have something that you can easily pull off, easily lock back into place and go to town with, then you're going to need the VCT shoulder brace, and then you need to buy your own VCT plate because it doesn't come with the shoulder brace. And the handle, I consider an essential piece to carry this thing, because when I have it fully rigged, it's 15 pounds, not counting the mat box, not counting any audio or light or anything else you've got going on. So you're going to be upwards of 20 pounds. You're going to need a handle. And the viewfinder, to use this on your shoulder, a viewfinder of some kind is essential. Whether you're going to swing out a third-party viewfinder on a magic arm, or whether you're going to use the, I think, pretty well-designed Blackmagic viewfinder, so, you know, so that if I have it here, I can tilt it down. If it's on my shoulder, I can tilt it up. If I have it low, I can look down, and it stays there. That's very well put together. All the pieces are very well done. All together, it kind of feels like it's just kind of cobbled together. The way the buttons are all on this face, as opposed to more easily accessible when it's on your shoulder, that creates a challenge. Rail holes that you're never really going to need, a really heavy viewfinder for something that's supposed to be carried on your shoulder. That's, you know, what broadcast kind of means. You know, it kind of seems like a lot of things haven't changed for the way this camera is supposed to be used in a broadcast type situation. Now, granted, there's also accessories for the back of this that will give you a triax hookup and a studio configuration, in which case you're not using the viewfinder, you're just using the plate, and this thing is in a studio thing with triax coming out of it, and you got, you know, communications on the back of the thing, and you're just shooting a TV show in a studio situation. In that case, again, it's still very affordably priced, and the design issues, which are more of a problem on the shoulder, are not as much of an issue when it's being used on a tripod, on a crane, on a Steadicam, or anything like that. Overall, I applaud Blackmagic for being the company that made a 4K B4 camera before most anybody else. When the JVC LS300 came out, this thing, it's awesome. It's an awesome camera. It's got this Super 35 sensor in here. I can use B4 lenses when I throw in the doubler. It's an awesome little camera. It is a pain to rig up. Like, okay, here, I've got it on a shoulder brace, and it's okay, but it's still very front heavy because the battery is built into the camera. There's not like anything else that's gonna happen back there. Where's my viewfinder? Where's my earphone? Where's, you know, it's not really designed to be on shoulder. And as much as I would have hoped JVC would have taken their 700 and 800 series of on-shoulder cameras, done the same thing with the lens, and put an extender with an optical adapter in it so that you get JVC 4K to a broadcast lens. That hasn't happened. Here it has. So, kudos to Blackmagic for making this happen. It has happened, it is available, it's amazingly affordable. I mean, the body with 4K and the capability, I mean, aside from the design issues, aside from the fact it's not a low light beast like other cameras are, and aside from the fact that the accessories are really designed for other URSA cameras, you know, the solution exists now to put B4 lenses on a 4K on-shoulder camera and go shoot. For that, and the price point, for that, you know, I think this camera is going to sell very well. As long as the low light issues don't get you, as long as the weight issues don't get you, as long as the limitations that are part of the URSA design don't get you, this solution, especially because it's the first on the market that I'm aware of, that is going to fill a niche that has been open for 10 years, I think, and this is going to sell to a lot of people who have been clamoring for exactly this. It would have been nice if it was, you know, better in low light. You can knock it down several stops, but getting up higher ISOs, better low light performance. Those, I hope, are features that come in the future. And with that, I wish Blackmagic the best with the URSA Broadcast. Me, myself, I think I'm going to stick with my GH4. I'm going to stick with my LS300. And when I need the capabilities of the B4 lens, I'm going to be using it on those cameras because they give me better low light performance, even with the doubler engaged. With that, my name is Anthony Barocas with AIBA Communications. Thanks for watching.